Good evening. This is Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, back with you with my weekly internet show. Nice to be back with you all again. Did you see where they had that big summit of the Americas in Colombia? It was really funny. I mean, President Obama goes down there, and several heads of state start talking about drug legalization. Now, this is a Latin America conference, you see, plus the United States. And these people in South America, Central America, and Mexico. I mean, they have paid an enormous price for this war on drugs, as we all know. I mean, in Mexico, I think in the last 6 years, it's 40 or 50,000 dead people. I mean, that's incredible. I mean, remember, in Vietnam, there was 58,000 American soldiers that lost their lives. This is almost reaching that number, and this is because of the war on drugs. You see, the president of Mexico had heard what Americans always had said, American statists, drug war proponents, and so forth, that, if we just crack down on the war on drugs, boy, we could really win this thing. I mean, that's the real secret. Let's just crack down. Well, the fact is, the United States has been cracking down ever since the beginning of this war. Asset forfeiture laws, mandatory minimum sentences, sending people to prison for the rest of their lives for small dope possession, and so forth. But in Mexico, they decided to bring the military in. Now, haven't we heard that from the drug war proponents here in the United States? Well, if we just got the military down there on that border, they'd crack some heads, and man, boy, we'd really win this war on drugs. It's inanity. I mean, it's total inanity. But the Mexico government did that. They brought the troops in, they brought them to the border, and the result was gang wars, vicious wars, gun shootouts, assassinations, more bribery than ever before among the judges and the prosecutors and the police, and in massive civil liberties violations, to the point where people were begging the soldiers to just leave, because they were doing like the soldiers do in Afghanistan and they did in Iraq, bashing down doors, no search warrants, no nothing. And they were going to really show you, how the cow's going to eat the cabbage here in this war on drugs. Well, the result is 40 to 50,000 people killed because of this crackdown. And of course, no end in sight. So you've got these heads of state from Latin America that are finally hearing what we libertarians have been saying for decades. There's just one solution to this thing: legalize it, end the war, end prohibition like we did with that big drug, alcohol, and therefore everything's returned to the legitimate, legal, free market. No more gang wars, because there's no more gangs, because now it's a legitimate market, just like alcohol or tobacco. The drug warriors can't compete in that kind of market. And so you get rid of all the violence that is associated with the war on drugs, with the illegality of this activity, plus all the corruption, plus all the asset forfeitures, where the cops are stealing people's money. And you also, eliminate the opportunity for bigots to join police departments and the DEA in order to, harass blacks and Hispanics and, get their jollies from their prejudice and their bigotry through the legitimate way of, the legal way of enforcing the war on drugs. So you got all these benefits, and we've been arguing this for decades, right? And we libertarians, is that this is ridiculous. I mean, we argue the moral case, of course, that people should be free to ingest whatever they want without being punished by the state. That's not freedom when the state can put you in jail for ingesting something. That's your business. That's your right. It may not be good for you, may be the worst thing in the world for you, but that's your freedom. And we've always made that case. But we've also made the utilitarian case that this war on drugs is just an abomination. Violence and corruption, and I mean, it's evil in every sense of the word. And these Latin America heads of state have finally figured it out. They're saying we need to legalize drugs. We need to end the war on drugs. At least debate it and discuss it. That's what they told Obama. And Obama freaked. I mean, oh my gosh, no, we can't even go down that road. We can't think about this. I mean, that's the trouble with these statists. They just will not let go of their failed programs. They've got a vested interest. Man, we're gonna finally make this war on drugs work. We're gonna finally win the war on drugs. Victory's right around the corner. Well, it's all ridiculous. I mean, and let's face it, there's a lot of people on the take. I mean, they've got a vested interest in this thing, the people on the take. Because if once you end the war on drugs and you repeal these drug laws, there's no reason for people to be paying bribes anymore. And everybody on the take knows that. So that's a big, constituency. You got all the people on the asset forfeiture dependency dole, the cops and the DEA and the prosecutors and, all the people that are out there stealing money from people and not even suing them for it. They just take it and they say, oh, well, if you don't like it, sue us. And many of the people are poor people. They're just traveling with cash because they deal in cash. And that's apparently a big crime here in the United States now. And so they just take their money and then they go out and, buy a new car for the police department, totally circumvent the legislative process on budgeting and everything. This is like a slush fund. And I mean, think of the perverse incentives here, but that's a big constituency. I mean, when you become dependent on the dole, as we all know, you're going to fight the elimination of that dole. And so, you've got this gigantic constituency. You got politicians that are out there politicking that, oh, gosh, I'm in favor of the war on drugs. And, of course, your average public school graduate says, oh, yeah, gosh, legalizing drugs, man, I'm not going to favor drugs. The people who want to legalize, that means they want drug abuse. And, I mean, that's the kind of thinking that goes on, right? That people are accustomed. I mean, they can't think in terms of, this is like prohibition. I mean, it's all over again. Prohibition, the violence, the Al Capone, the gang wars, and so forth. Well, it's exciting, though, that here you've got Latin Americans that are saying enough is enough. Now, my own opinion is they ought to just legalize it. Don't wait for the United States. They don't need the U.S. permission. Okay, yes, the U.S. will threaten them with a cutoff of foreign aid, but so what? They ought to be independent of foreign aid anyway. They ought to just get off that dole. And if President Obama gets mad or, Mitt Romney gets mad or whatever and says, oh, Latin America's not doing what we're telling them to do, big deal, Oh, by the way, there's also the military constituency, that the U.S. military plays a big role in down there enforcing drug laws. So they use that to justify their bigger and bigger budgets every year, not just their invasions and occupations in the Middle East and their empire bases. They use this drug war too as an excuse for ever-growing budgets, which is really ironic, when you stop to think about it, because we have what's called posse comitatus, that law here in the United States that says military is not going to be involved in law enforcement, and yet we send the military, our government's military, down to Latin America to enforce criminal laws, namely the war on drugs. Now, excuse me. So obviously, we consider it something bad for the military to be enforcing, criminal offenses, but we, have no reservations, or the government's got no reservations of sending the military down to Latin America to enforce these criminal laws. That's just part of the hypocrisy. But anyway, so we've got, a lot of movement in a positive direction on ending this war on drugs. And if we can end it just by virtue of public opinion, people sick and tired of it, family members whose lives are destroyed, the racism, the bigotry, and all of a sudden things shift and we get rid of this war, well, there's no telling what else could come tumbling down in terms of the welfare state, the warfare state, the interventionist state. But, at least people are thinking. I mean, you can Google drug legalization, drug war. Just Google drug war and under news, and you will be amazed at all the talk and discussion about drug legalization. It's absolutely incredible. I don't think I've ever seen so many articles coming out on ending the war on drugs. So it's very, very exciting. It's a very positive development. We've ruined enough people's lives, and really what the president ought to do, and maybe they'll do it when they get rid of this war and legalize drugs, is pardon every nonviolent drug offender. I mean, I get letters from people they're spending, 20, 30 years of their lives just for simple possession. I mean, it's just horror. It's an absolute horror. The one life the good Lord gave us, and these people are serving in a jail because they ingested something that the state is known to approve of. That is a real horror, a horror story that, it's horrible. Let me stick with Latin America, and then maybe if we got some time, I'll end up with Egypt. Egypt's absolutely fascinating how this thing's developing. I did an interview on RT on I think it was Friday, and we'll be linking to that in either Monday or Tuesday's email update. So be looking for that. But I did it on this Egypt situation. It's absolutely fascinating. But let me talk a little bit more about Latin America. These countries, sometimes by looking at foreign countries, you can learn a lot about your own country, and that's especially true right now in Venezuela. I mean, if it weren't so tragic, it would be humorous. I mean, the New York Times today's got a front page story about how people are struggling in Venezuela. Now, remember, yes, Venezuela is the one with all the oil. I mean, like oil fields galore everywhere. You know, and yet people are suffering extreme poverty. They have a tremendous shortage of toilet paper. People can't get toilet paper. Tremendous shortage of meat, of milk. One lady said that she stood in line like all day just to get one frozen chicken. Um, and so you have all these shortages of goods across society in a society that's got all that oil. Okay, now what's the reason for this? Well, it shouldn't surprise you to know that uh, Hugo Chavez, the president of Venezuela, is blaming freedom and free enterprise and the capitalists and the greedy capitalists. You see, because he's saying they're not bringing their goods to market. They're just hoarding them. They're keeping them from the people, and they're bad people, these capitalists. Sound familiar? I mean, isn't that what Franklin Roosevelt was saying when he was blasting the capitalists and big business and stuff, during the Great Depression? And oh, by the way, these shortages also happen in Venezuela also happen to come with price controls. Sound familiar? I mean, do you recall, the long lines at the service stations back in the 70s? Where shortages of gas and service stations were running out of gas? Uh, yes, there were price controls then. And don't you remember the government officials were saying the same thing that Chavez is saying today? That it's OPEC. Oh, man, it's big oil. Man, we got to go out and really punish big oil. They're holding back their oil supplies. Man, they're hoarding. Oh, they're causing all these shortages. That's exactly what Chavez is saying. These capitalists, they're not delivering their milk to market. And, it is absolute inanity. I mean, this is what happens when you impose a price control, when the government tries to keep prices low by mandating by law that people can't raise their prices over the amount set by the government. And that's what they've done in Venezuela. They have an extensive series of price controls, supposedly to help the poor. You see? And because, this is socialism. Oh, socialism is about loving the poor and the needy and disadvantaged. Don't we hear that from the left here? From the socialists here, the liberals, about how they love the welfare state because they love the poor, needy, and disadvantaged. Never mind that they're out there enforcing these horrible immigration restrictions on the poor. They don't like to talk about that, but they say they love the poor, just like Hugo Chavez. In fact, many liberals here in the United States point to Chavez and say, oh, he loves the poor, needy, and disadvantaged. And so Chavez says, I'm imposing price controls to help the poor so that, boy, they will be able to buy it all the necessaries of life at low prices. Well, okay, fine. But there's nothing to buy. So you got, wow, yeah, cheap milk, but where's the milk? One lady in the article was asked, where can somebody find milk today? Where does somebody go? She says, all you got to do is go to Chavez's home. It's all there. And that's usually the case. I mean, the government officials never are short anything. I mean, they have ways to get what they need, but it's the common people, the ordinary people that are just, they're the ones that are suffering, especially the poor, because there's nothing for them to buy. I mean, no toilet paper, no milk. I mean, it's just incredible. Okay, so why does this happen? Well, same sort of thing here is here in the United States. I mean, Chavez isn't dumb. I mean, he can look at the United States. He knows how government officials handle these things. That he's got this system of socialism where he's been nationalizing a lot of the businesses, and government's going to run them. Hey, that way there won't be a profit to have to be distributed to owners. It'll belong to the people and so forth. And so he has all these grandiose spending programs too. Sound familiar? Grandiose spending programs? Yeah. Well, he does what the government here does, the Federal Reserve does, and the central bank in Venezuela. They just print the money up to pay for these grandiose programs, artificially lower interest rates, saying this is the way to stimulate the economy. This is the way to expand prosperity. Print the money, artificially lower interest rates, inflate these bubbles, and this is the way we stimulate, and this is the way we get prosperous. And I mean, we libertarians have been saying what? For decades, that this is absolute craziness. It is just craziness. If a nation could print its way to prosperity, Zimbabwe would be wealthy. Any nation would be wealthy because it doesn't take much to run a printing press, right? Well, what inevitably happens when you've got this inflation of the money supply is prices of everything else are going to rise. And it's just a natural phenomenon because really what you're doing is you're debasing the value of the money. Now, everything trades in terms of the money, right? I mean, everything's priced in terms of the currency. So if you're devaluing the currency, the only way that's going to be reflected is that currency is going to have to buy less. It's devalued. It's not as valuable as it was yesterday. And so that's going to be reflected in the price of automobiles, the price of milk, the price of chickens. That price is going to go up, which is essentially saying that the value of your money is going down. It takes more of that money to buy things, and that can only be reflected by a higher price of those items. So that's what Chavez has been doing. Same thing that the U.S. does. Spends more than he has. Doesn't want to tax people because taxes make people mad or tax them more. So he just starts printing the money. The central bank does. And hey, we've got the same thing here, right? The debt ceiling, that they recently raised, that the government spending is out of control. And do you see them now lowering spending in anticipation of the next debt ceiling? No. In fact, all the staters are saying we got to spend more money. We got to borrow more money. And of course, the Federal Reserve is there to accommodate the debt. And that's what it's been doing since 1913. That's the purpose of the Federal Reserve. I mean, they'll say it's to stabilize the money supply. Well, that's ridiculous. They're there to accommodate the government spending programs. That's the whole purpose of a central bank. And that's why the dollar, the paper dollar that's, just irredeemable and nothing, is worth about, 5% of what it was worth when the Federal Reserve was established. Because decade after decade, government spending goes up, programs, need to be funded, and the Fed accommodates this ever-increasing government spending, debt, and so forth by just printing the money, artificially lowering interest rates, debasing the currency, perverting values, distorting investment decisions, inflating these bubbles. That's what's been going on in Venezuela. And so guess what Chavez says about all this? Well, he says the same thing that the U.S. officials say, that inflation has nothing to do with the government, that it's like an infection, like an illness, like the flu, that it sometimes strikes different people or different nations, and they say, oh gosh, the flu has hit America this year. Oh gosh, what a shame. Well, that's what they say about inflation. What a shame, what a shame. Inflation has hit America this year, and then they go on all these big campaigns to defeat inflation, but rally the people to defeat inflation. You'll recall during the Gerald Ford administration, they were passing out buttons called "Win." Whip inflation now, and they've got these big propaganda campaigns, sort of like they had in fascist Italy. or during the Roosevelt administration, the Blue Eagle, where they get everybody involved. We got to work on inflation, and man, we got to beat it because it's like the flu. It struck America, and they exhort businessmen, keep your prices down. They called it jawboning back in the 60s. The president needs to jawbone the U.S. Steel, to keep its prices down. And Ford was saying, whip inflation now and pass the buttons around. People were wearing these little win buttons. Well, what's the implication there? Well, the implication is the government's not responsible for this. Well, that's the problem. The government is responsible. The central bank is inflating the money supply, but they don't want people to know that. They want to blame it on big oil, and they want to blame it on OPEC or those greedy profiteers or those rapacious entrepreneurs or the grocery store owner. And Chavez is playing that game. He's out there blaming the capitalists and the people that are still permitted to own businesses there. Same thing Roosevelt did, when he, blasted businessmen and so forth, or any of these politicians, both on the left and the right here in the United States, that it's those big oil companies, we have to put an excess profits tax on, because like in the 70s they were withholding their oil from market. Well, so the government inflates the money supply. The prices of everything start rising. They start exhorting people, keep prices down, keep prices down. But people don't, because it's just natural. It's just the free market. It's not a free market because you had government intervening, but the market is reflecting the debasement of the currency with these rising prices. And so what does the government do? It makes matters even worse. It imposes price controls. It says you can't charge more than this. And then what happens? You inevitably have the shortages because people realize they can't make it. So there's no sense producing. They lose money by producing because they can't sell it at the price that it needs to be sold. So they just, either hold their goods back or they stop producing or both. And you end up with all these shortages. That's how you ended up with the shortage of gasoline, the service station lines in the 70s. And that's why they're undergoing shortages right now in Venezuela. And keep in mind that this whole move towards socialism, and this is what liberals just can't understand. That they can't understand that their policies, even when they think they're to help the poor, end up hurting the poor. Their economic policies. I mean, liberals are great on civil liberties. Okay, generally, Obama's horrendous. But by and large, the liberals are very good when it comes to civil liberties, like the ACLU or people like Glenn Greenwald and so forth. But when it comes to the economic part of this, liberals are absolutely they're horrendous. And conservatives, of course, are horrendous on civil liberties. They're a little bit better on economic liberty, but not much better. They still believe in a lot of the socialist programs and stuff. It's really the libertarians that are consistent all the way around, arguing for economic liberty and civil liberties as well. And on the economic liberty, what we understand and what statists don't understand is that with libertarianism, that's the way you help the poor. It's counterintuitive, but it works. That if you get government out of the business of helping the poor are much better off. Here you have in Venezuela all this oil, right? That's supposed to be the secret to wealth. Man, we just discover oil in a nation and stuff. It has nothing to do with oil. The wealth of a nation has to do with the extent to which government stays out of economic enterprise. To help the poor in Venezuela, get rid of the price controls, get rid of the central bank, the Federal Reserve there, get rid of the socialist programs, privatize everything, prohibit government from intervening in economic activity, prohibit government from establishing socialist programs, including Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, public schooling, grants, the whole kit and caboodle. And all of a sudden, you would see the standard of living of people at the bottom of the economic ladder soaring. Now, there'd also be very wealthy people, no question about it. But who cares? That's where you get into thou shalt not covet. Don't worry about those that have a lot of money. The fact is, when you see people at the bottom of the economic ladder, that their standard of living is soaring. It doesn't matter what everybody else is doing. I mean, you want to glorify in it because the wealthy are actually performing a great service in an unhampered market economy. They're opening up the businesses that are hiring the poor. They're investing their capital that are making the poor more productive in the businesses. More productivity means higher wages just through the virtues of competition. When there's a lot of businesses doing well, they start competing for workers, and they compete by paying higher wages. So everybody benefits from an unhampered market economy. This is what the socialists can't get. They just have a total blind spot. And we see it in Venezuela. You know, this man has embraced the policies of Fidel Castro, the socialist policies, and the result is the poor pay the biggest price. Let me jump over to Egypt for the last part of the segment here. Like I said, I did this program with RT last week that we'll be posting, but this is a fascinating situation there, and you know, we all ought to be keeping track of it because it has valuable lessons for our country too. I mean, you know, you've had this military dictatorship in power for 30 years, and the U.S. government has been a supporter of this dictatorship. I mean, you know, when the U.S. government's, you know, starts exclaiming against, you know, Assad in Syria, oh, the dictatorship there, or Saddam Hussein dictatorship there, this is just all, you know, propaganda. The fact is the U.S. government loves dictatorships. Absolutely has always loved dictatorship. Well, I mean, not always. The last, you know, 50, 60 years. As long as the dictatorships are pro-U.S. You see, the only ones they don't like are the ones that are independent of the U.S. empire. You know, Assad in Syria is a perfect example of that. Saddam Hussein was a crossover. He was a supporter of the U.S. empire, a member of it, and then he had a falling out, so they went out against him with a regime change operation. But in Egypt, this is one of the pro-U.S. dictatorships. So the U.S. has funded this dictatorship for, I mean, to the tune of, I think it's like $30 billion now. And they just finished sending another $1 billion to this dictatorship. Well, the Egyptian people are, you know, they rose up against this dictatorship, but the dictatorship thought if we just, you know, sacrifice Mubarak, the people will be happy. And so they figured the people are just unhappy with the dictator, but not with the dictatorship. Well, now, so the military, which plays an extensive role in society, including their intelligence force, same kind of extensive role as the military here plays in America in society. I mean, you know, where, you know, all this commercial and industrial activity is oriented toward the military here. It's just as extensive in Egypt. I mean, well, in Egypt, they're running hotels, they're running restaurants. Nobody knows the extent to which the military is operating in the economy, but because it's all classified, national security, etc. But it's extensive. And the military has let it be known, we will permit you to have elections, but the ultimate power will be with us because you're not going to get rid of us. We're the foundation of this society. National security is at stake, war on terrorism, you know, all the standard claptrap you get for this stuff. The military is saying, we come first, we will permit you to have elections and within certain parameters. Well, the Egyptian people are figuring out that's not a genuine democracy, and it isn't. A genuine democracy is not where the military is in control and ultimately in control. It's where the citizens are in control, where the citizens say, no, we will let you know whether you're going to exist, whether we want standing armies, what your budget's going to be, whether we're going to permit you to operate hotels or whatever. So you have a collision forming because I don't think the military is going to give up power. And this is one of the things the founding fathers of America warned about standing armies. That they're very, very dangerous because once they come into existence, they don't want to go out of existence. And we saw this in the warning with President Eisenhower too, where he said, beware the U.S. military-industrial complex because it is a very grave threat to our democratic processes. The Egyptian people are now confronting that, what Eisenhower said about the military-industrial complex. Because now in Egypt, the collision is forming. The citizenry are saying, we're in charge. We want a genuine democracy where the people are in charge and the military is subordinate. And the military is saying, we have the power. And we are funded by the U.S. government. We just got another $1.3 billion in armaments and money which, by the way, can be used in case the clash gets violent against the protesters. And so the thing is developing in a very fascinating way in terms of economics, in terms of politics, in terms of foreign policy here in the U.S. What does the U.S. do? I mean, they just help fund this military dictatorship to another $1.3 billion. That's our money, taxpayer money. How's this thing going to play out? Impossible to know. But the protesters, with all their diverse interests, seem to be coming together with one common goal, and that's to establish a genuine democracy, not one where the military is in charge, not one where the military is letting elections take place, which, by the way, they've done in the last 30 years. I mean, they would let elections take place, but where the genuine power rests with the people. In a democracy where if they want to dismantle the military-industrial complex, they can. Where they want to reduce the budget, they can. Where the people are in charge. So it's very, very fascinating, and it's going to be fascinating to watch as it plays out. Anyway, that's the show. Thanks so much for tuning in. Won't be with you next week, but it will be the week after that. We got our email Economic Liberty lecture series Monday, live streaming. But if you can't tune in, it's later on that evening. We do it with George Mason University's Econ Society, student-run libertarian group there. And we'll be linking to it in our FFF email update in the following week. We got Ben Powell, great libertarian professor. I think you'll really enjoy what he's got to say. So anyway, that's the show. Thanks so much for tuning in, and I'll see you in a couple weeks. So long.